Well, today we're in Psalm 52, and we're looking at a real scoundrel in this chapter. There's a fellow by the name of Doeg. The story is actually found in 1 Samuel chapter 21 and 22. And if you remember back in those days, Saul, who was the king of Israel, was pursuing David with the intent to kill him. Doeg discovers where David is, and David is among the priests. And when Saul arrives, he orders that all the priests be killed. Of course, the soldiers wouldn't stoop to that, but Doeg would, and killed all the priests, 85 actually in number. So we're looking at Psalm 52. We see a description of the character of this evil man. And so beginning in verse 1, we get the first characteristic. That is, here's a man that is filled with pride who boasts. Now, the boasting, incidentally, here is not overt kind of boasting that people sometimes parade in the streets. They want everybody to know who they are. It's a braggart, somebody who is pompous. But this is more of a covered up pride, where sometimes people can be very diplomatic, yet they feel that they are superior to others, at least that trait's hidden somewhat. And so he begins by talking about this boasting that thyself in mischief. And we just mentioned the evil that he had done. Mischief refers to kind of evil things that people do. And so I think that David is being somewhat sarcastic when he says, "Oh, mighty man," because Doeg certainly wasn't. As a matter of fact, killing all the priests, it was a mass murder, and these were people who were really defenseless. And so they weren't trained to fight, and so killing those people would not have been a courageous act, certainly not of a mighty man. And so I think he's belittling or being sarcastic about this man. And when he speaks about the goodness of God, you'll see a little bit later that what's going to happen, and you may not think about it this way, but the goodness of God brings judgment against this evil man, and it will serve as a lesson you'll see later in the chapter. In verse number 2, you see about his tongue, and boy, does tongue get us into a lot of mischief, but also it's a weapon to hurt other people. And so, of course, he reported, and it was an evil report about David, where David was, a little place called Nob, N-O-B. And, if you mention how deceitful he is, he uses the idea of a razor, which would have been used to cutting somebody's hair, but he uses it to cut somebody's throat. In verse number 3, you see another characteristic of this man, and that is he loveth evil more than good. And that's a real concern today, isn't it? There are people who actually love to do evil things. Now, hold on a minute. I want you to think about that. There are actually people in the world that love doing evil things and lying, and integrity is really being challenged today rather than speak righteousness. Now you see that pause again that David uses in the Psalms, that Selah. It's meant for us to ponder about this and to think about how evil some people are, and to give thought to it, not only about them, but how we ought not to be. In verse number 4, thou loveth all devouring words, and thou deceitful tongue. And so again, it's amazing, isn't it? And I don't know, sometimes even good people realize how hurtful and harmful our tongue can be when using it as a weapon against others. It's a thing that needs to cease and not be part of a Christian man's life. In verse number 5, God shall destroy thee forever. So this is going to be the outcome of this evil man. You can't run from justice. Sooner or later, God is going to deal with that, if not in this life, certainly in the next. He shall take thee away, pluck thee out of the dwelling place, and root thee out of the land of living. So death is going to happen. Now, it's interesting if we would give thought to the consequences of our doings and notice that there is an outcome, and that ought to prevent us to go down that course in life. In verse number 7, the righteous shall also see. What are they going to see? Well, they're going to see the judgment of God against this person, and that will serve, as a lesson that what happens, you see, to those who are unrighteous, they'll reap what they sow, but it also ought to give us a warning is not to follow in their footsteps, just be everything that they're not. Now, in verse number 7, lo is the man that made God not his strength. And of course, there's so many of those. And of course, this individual that we're talking about, God certainly wasn't his strength. He thought he was a mighty man, but he really wasn't. And his strength wasn't in God. And so it's important. Notice, secondly, he says he trusted in the abundance of riches. Do you see the challenging things here in this particular verse? I mean, this verse has a whole lot to say, doesn't it? I mean, men who do not trust in God, that do not find their refuge in God. God is not their fortress or shield. Their strength really is not in God. They're relying completely on themselves, and they trust in the abundance of their riches. And he strengthened himself in wickedness. Those are three traits that are very, very serious. Now, in verse number 8, here's a contrast. David says, but I am like the green olive tree. Olive trees would last a long time. And here, one that's green and in the house of God. Notice this phrase here as opposed to Doeg. And it's a very important phrase, I think, where he says, I trust in the mercy of God forever and ever. Boy, isn't that something to trust in? Do you do that? Trusting and having confidence in the mercy of God. Now, verse number 9, I will praise thee forever. And one thing we've been saying through the Psalms, you see it over and over and over again. And I think repetition is a good lesson. It's not just being redundant, but there's a purpose to being repetitious, and that is for us to learn in a very sincere way to praise the Lord forever and ever because of what he has done. And so David is praising the goodness and mercy of God for the acts of God. And I will wait on thy name. And we talked a lot about that in the Psalms. Waiting always implies trusting in. You don't wait for something you don't trust. For he is good to thy saints. So that's a very short psalm today, Psalm 52, but it has some profound lessons for us to ponder and think about today. And so we'll see you next week. If you have the opportunity, we hope you'll be with us on Sunday morning as we worship the Lord at the Columbiana Church of Christ in Columbiana. And so we'll be seeing you next week if we don't see you on the Lord's Day. And we'll be looking at, boy, we're just moving through the text now. We'll be in Psalm chapter 53. So we'll see you then.